This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On January the 9th, the Department of National Defence hosted the launch of a new book by Dr. Andrea Charron and Dr. James Fergusson, entitled NORAD, Perpetuity and Beyond.
Today. Bonjour tout le monde. I am Lieutenant Navy Alicia Morris with the D&D Stakeholder Engagement Office here in Toronto. I'm pleased to be your moderator for this evening's book launch event for NORAD, in Perpetuity and Beyond. We always enjoy sharing fellowship with our associates and friends here at RCMI, and we are pleased to have the President with us tonight. Please help me welcome Lieutenant Colonel Retired Michael Clary to offer a welcome.
Thank you very much. All I would like to say is welcome. It's good to see people at the Military Institute for an event like this. The Military Institute has a mandate. It is charity. We have a mandate for education on strategic affairs, and military history. So this is just the sort of event that we like to be able to provide a venue for and host. And it's good to get people out to see it. Thank you very much. Welcome to the Institute, and feel free to take a look around. The whole facility is a museum, and we have an incredible library up on the next floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. As we've gone over, we'll have a Q&A period at the end of the presentation, and your questions are encouraged. We are fortunate this evening to be joined by Major General Huddleston, Commander of 1 Canadian Air Division, and the CANAR Commander, to introduce our authors. Major General Huddleston enrolled in the Canadian Armed Forces in 1989, graduated with a Bachelor of Mechanical Engineering from the Royal Military College in 1994. In July 2022, Major General Huddleston assumed command of 1 Canadian Air Division in Winnipeg, which is only one of a few hats he does wear. He is also commander of the Canadian NORAD region, conducting aerospace warnings and aerospace control and defense operations. As the Joint Forces Air Component Commander, he provides air power to assist CJOC as they conduct operations domestic and abroad. He is also the commander of Search and Rescue Region in Trenton, responsible for the aeronautical search and rescue operations in the largest of Canada's 3 SAR regions. Finally, he is the Operational Airworthiness Authority for the Canadian Armed Forces. Sir, I'd love to bring you to the lectern.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for having me. Oh, I got microphones here, too, so I won't yell. Usually, I speak too loudly, so I don't want to deafen you. The acoustics in this room are great, so thanks very much for having me. Thanks for joining us for this signature event. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening for the launch of NORAD in Perpetuity and Beyond. The subject of NORAD and continental defense issues is one that is not discussed enough in Canada. And while we periodically have events occur, such as the balloon event that we saw this past week, as well as Russian military aviation skirting the Canadian Air Defense Identification Zone, the importance of this unique binational military command is unfortunately often overlooked by Canadians. But the security of North America is not something we can afford to take for granted. As Chief of Defense Staff General Eyre has said recently, the world is becoming a more dangerous place. Indeed, the brutal Russian assault on Ukraine is now approaching its grim 1-year anniversary and serves as a reminder to us that we must constantly be on guard here at home, because there are actors willing to use violence in the world to achieve their aims. As Commander of Canadian NORAD region, defending this continent's airspace is a mission that I take very seriously. But air defense in a nation as vast as Canada is challenging, especially when you consider our weather, our dispersed population, and our limited military capacities. To accomplish this mission, I rely on the network of radars, air-to-air satellites, and other sensors, Canadian and American fighter aircraft, air-to-air refuelers, and airborne warning and control aircraft. I also rely on the thousands of Americans and Canadians who work within the Canadian NORAD region under my command. While we possess a wide range of capabilities, we know that we must modernize NORAD to meet the challenges of today and the future, something the two authors I'm about to introduce understand very well. Both are well known to us at CANAR. They possess a wealth of information concerning NORAD's history, present operations, and have written this compelling book that details where the future might take us. Dr. Andrea Charron holds a PhD from the Royal Military College of Canada, the Department of War Studies, and obtained a Master's in International Relations from Webster University, Leiden, the Netherlands, as well as a Master's of Public Administration from Dalhousie University and a Bachelor of Science Honors from Queen's University. Beyond NORAD, her research and teaching areas include the Arctic, foreign and defense policy, and sanctions. She serves on the Department of National Defense's Advisory Board and has published in numerous peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Charron has worked for various federal departments, including the Privy Council Office in the Security and Intelligence Secretariat and the Canada Revenue Agency. She is now Director of the University of Manitoba's Centre for Defense and Security Studies and an Associate Professor in Political Studies. Dr. Jim Fergusson is the Deputy Director of the Centre for Defense and Security Studies and a full professor in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. He holds a PhD from the University of British Columbia and researches and publishes in the fields of strategic studies and Canadian defense policy. He is the former honorary colonel of the Canadian Forces School of Aerospace Studies, which is now the William Barker College, and of 2 Canadian Air Division in Winnipeg. And I have a personal relationship with both of them, given that my wife was tutored by the two of them while she was doing her Master's of Political Studies. So I've known them for quite a while, and I'm personally I'm proud to be part of their circle of friends and their circle of influence. He certainly influenced my way of thinking. I'll stop there because you didn't come to listen to me, but rather you came to listen to our two authors and hear about their wonderful book. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. It's a cold and rainy day, and you've come down to this beautiful facility. We're so grateful to the RCMI for hosting us here. Thank you very much. We have Richard Ratzlaff, who's at the back there from McGill Queen's University Press, who held both our hands as we went through this process, and we're eternally grateful for his indefatigable patience, which is what he needed. We're really grateful to Major John O'Connor and his staff for setting this up for us. This book would not have been possible if it wasn't for Major General Huddleston and the unprecedented access we had to successive NORAD command teams. And it always amazed me that they would open the doors to 2 academics, often that were, clueless in so many different areas, and ask question after question. And they just, with extreme patience, kept trying to walk us through to a point where then we could start asking tough questions to hopefully maybe propel NORAD to what we call in perpetuity and beyond. And the title is because it's not Buzz Lightyear, as I now realize. It's not Infinity and Beyond, but it's because the agreement, the binational agreement, was signed in perpetuity in 2006. In Canada, it was always, a bit of angst every time the agreement had to be renewed, about every 5 years. What would be added, what would be maybe taken away? Because the question was always asked, well, why do we need NORAD? And especially when we had the creation of US Northcom and then the creation of the Canadian Joint Operations Command, the question always became, well, why do we need NORAD? We have US Northcom, we have CJOC, let's get rid of the middleman. And so we built on the exceptional scholarship of Richard Goette at the Canadian Forces College and Joseph Jockle, who have both written incredible books on NORAD. Richard Goette came up to 1957 when NORAD was operational. Joseph Jockle took it to 2006. And we take it beyond that because I think from 2006, when it added a maritime warning function and the fallout of 9/11, given the geopolitical changes, the really exciting things for NORAD have happened and are going to continue. And we have the Chinese balloon to thank for that. We start with a little bit of the history behind 9/11 because while we know the American story very well, the Canadian story has never really been told, so we try and outline that. But one of the things we didn't expect, and this is from the 10 plus years of doing the research, was how important we think the maritime warning mission for NORAD has been for other government departments to force them to work together, because the fear was, why is an air-centric organization taking over our turf? And it's done some incredible things, including the creation of a maritime security operations centers on the east-west coast and the Great Lakes. But it's also indicative of how exceptional NORAD is, because it has a global area of operations. It's not constrained by an area of responsibility. And we now realize that maritime warning is the start of this all-domain awareness that we're really after, and it's just the beginning. And one of the things James and I argue is that what we really need to get to, although it will be politically difficult, is to get to a North American Defense Command, because our adversaries are not thinking about domain-specific threats. They are utilizing, trying to probe us in those seams between the different domains. And so what we try and think about is what's going to come beyond the 2006 agreement. The final thing I'll mention before I hand it over to James for some comments is we go back to the Arctic, because the Arctic has always been the bread and butter of the North American Air Defense Command and now Aerospace Defense Command. In fact, it's the reason we have it. It was that idea that the Soviet Union could attack us over the top of the world, and therefore we need a number of radar lines to give us advanced warning. But we're now thinking differently about the Arctic. We used to think of it as almost a sort of a speed bump, a chance to get advanced information and potentially stop a threat. But our Arctic, being 40% of our landmass, has so much potential. But we haven't been thinking about it in that way. And I think with NORAD modernization and the amounts of dollars we're thinking about, if we do it with thought and with the rights holders and in co-development, we really could transform our Arctic and make it the sustainable new development, the place where people want to be developing our resources in the future. So I'm really excited about what NORAD can do for the Arctic.
Thanks, Andrea. Is this still on? Oh, okay. I don't know why I need a microphone. Yeah. By the way, I hate taping and I hate my picture being taken. Just so that everyone, because I've been watching, there she is again with the camera. Anyways, thanks Major General Huddleston for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to make one corrective. Andrea is not an associate professor anymore. Although technically July 1st, she will become a full professor. She has been promoted, and it's long overdue. I want to keep my remarks short. There's a lot to go over in the NORAD world. There's a lot of issues about the future of NORAD. And what we argue on the functional grounds that we date back exactly to the work of Goethe and Jocko about where we're likely to go. The politicians don't know that yet. And so I want to raise 2, 3, maybe 4 points to you. First is the great dilemma of NORAD, or the great paradox of NORAD. NORAD has been successful over the decades because it's been below the political radars. Neither the government in Washington nor the government in Ottawa, in some ways, national defense and the Defense Department of the United States aren't paying attention. So the net result of this is that NORAD can move forward and do things to meet their functional and vital role for the defense and security of North America in the aero domain, and actually it's the aerospace domain, because there's air surveillance, early warning, integrated tactical warning and attack assessment role that they play, but it also extends to the ballistic missile world. But NORAD's able to do these things and is able to slowly evolve. It has done very quietly because it stays out of the political radar, and particularly in the case of Canada, the sensitivity and why the importance of renewing NORAD in perpetuity was so vital. It stays out of the political domain, and the sensitivity that you all are aware of Canada's relationship with the United States. Vitally important, as we all know, but politically sensitive. Of course, at the same time, the paradox is being out of the radar makes it very problematic for NORAD to get the attention and, in the result of it, the funding it needs to deal with the evolving and advancing threat environment, by and large technologically driven within the context of the geopolitical environment we live in. And I'm not sure if it's a paradox or a dilemma, but it's an interesting balancing act. How do you push forward to do the things that NORAD needs to do in modernization, and not more than just NORAD, but North American defense modernization, within the political climate because it's politically sensitive? So that's the first point I wanted to make to you. The second point that I think is really important to recognize that, and I'm not sure if Major General Huddleston will agree with me, but Andrea and I have argued this. Maybe Andrea won't agree with me, but Andrea and I do disagree about things, by the way, is NORAD is structured and has not, although it's evolved and things have changed over time, but by and large, NORAD's still structured, except for the Maritime Warning Mission, as a Cold War entity. They're still locked in the Cold War. The Cold War is gone. The post-Cold War era of the last 2 decades is gone. We live in a new world with new technology, new threats environments, and it means that NORAD has to, and the drive will come from below from NORAD, because we've seen it, that we need to modernize not just technology and capabilities, but we need to modernize exactly what NORAD's role and function is going to be in the future. Failure to do so, as I think we clearly argue in the book, will mean the marginalization of NORAD, which is not in Canadian interests. And we see this in several new domains that have emerged in terms of the integrated, what the Americans call all domain, what Canada calls pan domain, in the areas of the maritime world. If the aerospace world, the air world, is efficiently and effectively delivered as it has been done for decades by NORAD, a binational command, why does this not extend into the maritime domain? Why aren't we talking about a maritime control, not just warning, but maritime control in a binational basis? Now, I could tell you a lot about why the navies don't like this. My apologies to the naval officers here. Well, actually, no, I don't apologize. I never apologize. Until my wife tells me to apologize, then I do. The aerospace domain, it's interesting that roughly, and Major General Huddleston may know this better than I, but roughly 2 decades ago, the American Air Force dropped aerospace, and they shifted to air and space. What an irony, because now air and space are blurring. We are actually emerging into an aerospace, truly aerospace world, occasioned right now by hypersonic vehicles, weapons. And this becomes another big new domain that has to be integrated for the defense and security of North America. There are now aerospace threats. And this, of course, raises my favorite issue from long ago, missile defense questions. which the Americans are integrating. So you have that domain emerging that needs to be integrated in North American defense. We talk at the end of the book about the cyber world, and the cyber world is a really difficult world because it's not just government and militaries involved. There's a private sector playing in this game. And that's a difficult one to overcome. And the land domain as well. So essentially, when we sort of try to walk you through the domains from 9/11 and through the domains we're talking about this idea that we are on a slow evolutionary path to a truly integrated North American Defense Command, which doesn't mean we lose our sovereignty. It means nothing to that sense at all. It enhances our sovereignty at the end of the day. This will be a slow, gradual process, abetted by the fact no one in Washington and Ottawa is paying attention. And that's a really good thing, it seems to me, at the end of the day. And it was like, if for those of you who know the history of NORAD, NORAD popped out after roughly a decade or so of air defense cooperation as a logical solution. Sold to the government by wasn't the chief of the defense staff, that wasn't the label back then in 1957. Sold as a NATO commitment to the government, because Diefenbaker was keen about NATO and Europe, not the US relationship, in which was, of course, a nice spin, I guess you would put it, if you were a spin doctor. But this is what we see as the path is going in the future. And it's fraught with landmines, mines, dangerous political mines. And I think if I can conclude here, the central point of the book is to try to educate, to try to provide information and detail. And we worked very hard to make sure, dealing with all the military officials and others that we talked to who gave open doors for us. One of the things we always said to them, read this. We want to make for sure we're accurate. We don't want to get anything wrong. Don't mess with the substantive stuff. You don't get to play with that, but make sure we have it all right. And the point is to try to educate the public. You don't want to hear my views about the public. That's not nice. But national defense, the U.S. Department of Defense, the government officials, politicians, so that when this all starts to unfold, and it will as the money starts to get invested, it's all going to come out. Issues that no one's talking about yet, political issues, structural issues, when this all comes out at the end of the day, that my hope springs eternal, even though I'm a pessimist, because when you're a pessimist, you're never disappointed, that we can have actually a proper, educated, insightful, and knowledgeable debate. Rather than all of you probably here know, our history of debates on defense in Canada are, shall I be nice or shall I be mean? Be nice. Are somewhat naive, childish, problematic. But that, as I like to say at the end of the day, well, you know, it's Canada. What do you expect from us? So anyways, that sort of gives you an idea of the overview and the thrust we were driving at in the book. The sad thing about the book, and I should shut up. I know I should shut up, but I'm an academic. We don't shut up. I hate the government and national defense for one reason. We wrote this book several years ago, and it had to go through the process of publications, and the government and the department dared to, just before it was coming out, to announce massive funding to NORAD modernization. Thanks a lot, boys and girls. We have to rewrite the last chapter. We need to rewrite the last chapter. But we're still on path, I think. So thanks very much for coming, and look forward to your questions.
I think with the funding, though, hopefully what we've provided some food for thought, and especially about potentially new partners in the future. Yeah. Maybe it needs to go beyond being binational. And also how to integrate the different domains and to continue the process of evolution and some of the incredible exercises that NORAD does, which doesn't get a lot of attention, but how to really shake them up and integrate them too with other government departments, because we all know when we're going to have massive crises, it's never just in one domain, it's never just with one adversary, it's often multiple things all together, and so integrating that whole of government process is one of the things we advocate for. So we're happy to answer any questions, or if you have any for the general as well.
Thank you. The question's for Jim. You mentioned ballistic missile defense, and I reflect on when we originally signed into NORAD in the 50s, senior military officers were accused of lying to the government back then about it was something that the government was going to sign on to, but there was an election, etc. BMD has been a controversial political issue ever since. And I just think from an audience perspective, your thoughts on inevitability of having to sign on if we're going to deal with hypersonics, or whether or not, if I can kind of paraphrase what you said about BMD and kind of under the radar, as soon as you raise that issue in Canada, sovereignty becomes an issue and it's no longer under the radar.
You're right. That's the real great danger. But I don't think you can buy it anymore except maybe used on Amazon. But I wrote a book on missile defense. It's always been my favorite topic. And I'm not going to go through the details of that. But let me ask all of you a question. The last announcement from the government with regards to missile defense was the defense minister, Anand, in Trenton when she announced the NORAD modernization of $40 billion or 20 years and was asked about missile defense. And she said, no, we haven't changed our policy, but we're keeping, I can't remember the exact words, keeping an eye on it. We're thinking about it. Ask yourselves this. Exactly why or when has the Canadian government ever provided an explanation for why they said no? The best explanation we have, it goes back to Paul Martin, and he didn't even say it. He had the foreign minister say it publicly in the House, that we didn't think there was anything in it for us. Well, what does that mean? Why do we have this anathema? What's the problem here? And a lot of it goes back to the legacy of the Cold War and strategic stability, which I won't go into. But you cannot avoid missile defense. The ability of Canada to stay aloof from it has largely been as not unusual for Canada or for any state given the American political position and military position as a dominant power, has largely been because none of the American missile defense programs, as they've evolved over the past 50 years, have created any necessity for Canadian territory, thus Canadian participation. As long as that continues to obtain, there is no pressure on Canada from the United States. And again, what I mean by pressure is not explicit pressure, but implicit pressure which affects our thinking about what to do. This is changing in two ways. One, of course, is something we've lost sight of, which the Americans haven't, but they have not paying a lot of attention anymore. One is, of course, is the failed of the, I can never remember, the JPOC, the joint, whatever it is, the agreement on the Iranian nuclear program that's collapsed. And it doesn't look like it's going to be renewed. And this, relative to the Iranian ballistic missile program, raises significant issues about a potential, or in the near-term future sometime, that there will be a long-range Iranian ballistic missile threat married to nuclear weapons in North America. In that case, Canada suddenly becomes territorially important. And the marker of all this will be where the United States goes. And of course, now you get into issues between the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States with regards to a third missile defense site, which has been earmarked for upstate New York. If that happens, then Canadian territory starts to become very important in terms of forward deployed radar, tracking radars, cueing radars, and battle damage assessment radars. We will, now there's a way the Canadian government can weasel it away around this, and this is the NORAD connection, which is valuable to us. So that's one element. The second element of this is the fact that the United States has been undertaking a process begun by the US Army. Missile defense is an Army function. It's not Air Force, although the Navy has involved, but primarily for North America and for overseas forces, this is Army function. The US Army capabilities are in a process of integration. They wish to integrate both short range, medium range, long range, and ballistic missile defense capabilities into an integrated capability where they would take their various systems from the short range air defense systems that the US Army deploys on their strikers to Patriot, the short range ballistic missile defense and high altitude air defense, to THAAD, the theater area defense, to the ground-based missile defense, strategic defense, and integrate them for the effective and efficient application of resources. Once they do that, and hypersonics is one of the issues that's driving this, once that happens, the ability of Canada to say, oh, we're just going to do air, becomes extremely problematic. And this is a function of territorial considerations in a geopolitical environment. So this is an issue which is one of those that the government doesn't want to talk about. I would love to know why they're so nervous about this. I don't understand it. There's no strategic explanation. There's no logical explanation. The old explanation of the Cold War, which this was strategically destabilizing, doesn't obtain anymore because missile defense is our reality now. We have to deal with that reality. And the danger behind all this, as the U.S. moves down this way, is that NORAD, and we point this out in the book, that NORAD will be marginalized. It'll be stuffed in an air control world and basically told to go away. And don't be bothered. And that will start to unravel the relationship, which will lead to more unilateral American decisions about the defense of North America, which is simply not in our strategic and political interests. That's a short answer to it. Big long thing, I think. Yeah.
Next questions. Oh, he's gonna buy.
You should answer it. You don't want to touch that.
Hello. Thanks for taking my question. So you mentioned that the U.S. Army has the missile defense capability. I've heard a lot of talk about how the Canadian Army has no air defense capability. Is there, a Canadian stopgap or solution to that problem, or is it? I guess it doesn't necessarily fall under NORAD's prerogative.
Which? Okay, you go first. That one, because I'll answer it too.
Yes, there is. It's involved with it's a capability that we're looking at investing in to equip the brigade in Latvia with. Short to medium range, I believe, is the focus. It's piggybacking on the back of the ground-based air defense project, which existed prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but now the urgency is somewhat increased, and I believe it was publicly discussed in an article just the other day, actually, what's happening with respect to that. That's one of, I think, 3 urgent requirements that are being pursued in support of the brigade in Latvia. The concept of a brigade in Latvia, we haven't quite landed on that decision yet either. Currently it's a battalion. But at the center of a multinational brigade. But that's being pursued as part of our effort to shore up the defenses in Latvia.
I don't disagree at all, but it's very nice, and this is an age-old problem in Canada, and it's also replicated in the United States, that we're going to equip a brigade, ground troops, with short to medium range air defense, be integrated in the NATO air defense, which will have to include sometime down the road ballistic missile defenses, as well hypersonic defenses. That's great for the brigade. But what about North America? It's fine that the government is committed out of the last July's fact sheet from D&D that the defeat mechanism of North American defense, NORAD, if you will, is the acquisition of short, medium, and long-range air-to-air missiles. That's a very good layer. But as we all know, no defense is perfect. There will be leakers. What are we going to do with the leakers? Because once they pass that line somewhere in the Arctic, there's nothing. We have no ground-based point defenses. We have no ground-based theater defenses. The United States does, but we don't. So the question emerges is why, and I'm waiting to see with the defense review update that's coming, why isn't anyone talking about the need for homeland defense and the need to acquire some degree of point defenses, at least, if not theater defenses, which have certainly hypersonic defense capabilities for those we can't shoot down. And it remains to be seen if the air-to-air missile systems that we're going to acquire are going to be capable to go up high to the hypersonic world. So that's a big gap to me. And again, it reflects a long-standing priority in Canada, like the United States, that somehow our defensive priority is overseas all the time. We stop the wars by going overseas. And there's nothing, I'm critical about that. But if you forget North American defense, you forget it at your political peril, because it will affect calculations about committing forces.
The other thing we're starting to see is an awareness that before it was NORAD does things over here, NATO does things over here. The various combatant commands have their area of responsibility, and it's sort of hermetically sealed. And whatever, it's a bit like that motto, and whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But we're realizing, no, we need to be able to integrate that information and intelligence and pass that information on. And again, this is where NORAD, and it was a difficult road to take on the maritime warning mission, because it's at the end of the intelligence fusion chain. It has the ability to see the intelligence and information that everybody else has seen and even may have acted on. But it's that last opportunity to see, but what does this mean in a North American context? And that's the real importance of NORAD. That they're not thinking Canada or the United States, and they're not doing things in parallel. They're doing things for North America, about North America, and not only looking at the approaches to North America, but now because of 9/11 within North America. And that importance of what Canadians call continental defense, the Americans called homeland defense, has been out of sight, out of mind, but we're realizing how vulnerable we are. And this is why, we're hoping that the book will help convince Canadians and Americans that NORAD does matter, that is well beyond Santa Tracker, and that, especially in these changing geopolitical times, we need to put emphasis on the defense of North America, which speaks directly to your question.
I'd like to ask a question about interoperability. I guess in a perfect end state, there would be a unified command, but I'm wondering if, maybe they start with the general, are you training with naval assets? Does NORAD train with naval assets and or land assets that there might be a virtual get together of the multiple elements that would predate, as a predecessor to a fully integrated command?
Did you say naval assets or NATO assets?
Naval.
Naval.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we do. We well, currently in Canada, the Aurora simulator in Greenwood is connected to the naval simulators, their ships and their submarines. We haven't quite made the link between the MHP, the Cyclone simulators, and the naval simulators, but beyond that, we exercise with them all the time. So I have the NORAD hat, but I also have the OneCat hat, which is the force generation of all the force elements that will deploy globally. And for me, there isn't much distinction. I run the Operational Air Force. The Operational Air Force serves NORAD. It serves CJOC. It serves CANSOFCOM. But training those force elements can be used for any mission. So in the maritime warning dynamic,
or more specifically, the maritime control dynamic, I'm working for CJOC. So those units are participating in joint exercises both with naval forces, and then in the littoral, they're operating with Army as well. In a recent Canadian exercise, we deployed the new, I forget what the radars are called, but they're the new Army radars in Gagetown, whose purpose are counter battery fire. But we deployed them, integrated them into a Navy, Air, and Army exercise, and then on top of that, put in a NORAD element on top of the joint exercise that was truly being conducted. Well, it was an exercise, so it wasn't specifically in support of CJOC, but you get the point. CJOC is the force employer, but in this instance, we were exercising, but we included both a JFAC and a NORAD element to that effort to test and to try and integrate our capabilities. So no, we're not at the point that's described aspirationally in the book, but we're certainly working on those sorts of integrated efforts to improve our capabilities outside of the three domains or the three mandates of NORAD.
As an academic, one of the things that we would love to do is to dream up some of the exercises, because I think they tend to, and naturally and justly, focus on the tactical level. But they're not so good at linking the strategic level. And this is not just NORAD, this is everything. When you think about the number of Arctic exercises we had, and we had Arctic Edge that the US runs, and Operation Nanook, and Cold Response that NATO did, and at no time was there any attempt to link them strategically via communication to say, we may be practicing different things, working on different skills and interoperability, but we're all allies, and we are all working along a continuum. And this would be a strategic message, I think, to a lot of our adversaries that we don't take advantage of. I'd like to also see more political affairs and communications people part of the exercise and throwing them in, because I think one of the things we're realizing is that communication is another domain of warfare. And if you don't give out that information and you don't provide it strategically and you don't have your in-house communication ready to go, it can be a force multiplier, or it can be, another threat that's added to the mix. So really shaking up exercises to go beyond just the tactical to most crises are never going to be in just one domain requiring this capability with this adversary. It's going to be this is happening along with a whole bunch of other stuff happening. And so really taking the opportunity to have strategic exercises. If we were asked to develop exercises, now there have been some NORAD commanders who tried that. Admiral Gortney was famous for throwing exercises on their heads, and I think some people are still in counseling as a result. But I think more and more that's going to be exercising the parts that you don't think are important or you don't think you might need, or exactly the ones that you need to poke and prod.
I would just briefly add, my wife always complains about me in family discussions is, why can't I say something nice? Why do I always criticize everyone? So I'm going to say something nice just for her. We have seen, I think Andrea would agree with me, we have seen since we started looking at NORAD roughly a decade or so ago, a dramatic improvement of exercises going from NORAD to engaging CJOC, engaging the NORTHCOM naval side, even starting to get the NATO people to pay attention to exercises. It's been a difficult time to do it. It's not easy, because we saw that in the maritime warning, but I think driven also by the global information dominance experiments that the US are driving to integrate, that this is something that's going to advance further and further and generate more effective and efficient integration of all the domains and the forces involved. And it's one of the forces involved that will drive forward an expanded NORAD mission suite. So that's been a really positive thing that I've seen, that we've seen over time. If I think back to 2012 and 2013, we talked to NORAD, trying even to get CJOC on the phone was a problem. And now they're starting to engage, they're starting to understand. And it's a strange thing. It goes back to maritime warning. NORAD driving is the driver. It's ironic. NORAD is the real driver behind this, which drives everyone forward. And that's one of the great underappreciated values of the relationship, as it did in maritime warning cooperation between the two countries, between the civilian agencies and the military. NORAD drove it forward. And no one expected that was going to occur, I don't think, when they started it, when they got into this. But all these things are drivers forward. And I mean, we haven't been down, we haven't talked to them about recent exercises. It'd be nice to get a new briefing, but I think you're getting more and more buy-in by all the domains, more involvement in them, breaking down barriers, breaking down intelligence barriers, communication barriers, and these are all vital for the effective and efficient defense, the effective and efficient North American deterrent posture relative to our adversaries.
So I have two questions related. I haven't read the book, so can you speak to the maritime warning issues in the book, particularly around the Arctic? And then my second question is to speak to the challenges that the government is going to have to spend $40 billion in the next 10 years on NORAD renewal.
So I'll start with the first one with the maritime warning. And NORAD has actually two. They can do maritime warning, which means an immediate threat. But they realized the first one that they gave in 2010 when the Sun Sea was coming towards British Columbia with migrants on board, a warning wasn't what they needed. What they needed was an advisory. And so they now have a second category called advisories. In an Arctic context, it's more about sending our maritime operating picture down to eventually get to NORAD. But it starts in Halifax with an all-government department assessment that creates a picture. It's sent to NAV North, which adds their picture to it and adds often Five Eyes information. And then it goes to NORAD at the end of the intelligence chain to say, okay, well, let's look at this through North American lens. What I would like to see in the future, one of the complaints often in the Arctic is that the federal agencies know the picture because they created it and share it, but the locals have no idea what the picture is. And so, for example, a cruise ship will pop up out of nowhere that, had they known in advance that it was coming, would have been better prepared to make sure that their artisans had products ready to go to help drive the economy. So I think we're going to see in the future, maritime warning and the fact that an air-centric organization was taking a domain that, should have been part of the naval world, force the other government departments to get together and create things like a common lexicon so that they could share information without prejudicing any future court cases. It's always sensitive whenever you're sharing information that may have a legal component to it. But that's been sorted. The next thing is to take it from the federal, and what are the other local and territorial partners that should be part of understanding this picture and certainly have key information to pass along, so that we truly have a really rich and full picture of activity happening in the maritime Arctic world, as opposed to what is within the jurisdictions of the mandates of federal governments.
You're going to have to remind me the second question because it slipped because I'm old. But 40, oh yes, okay. To your first question, I would answer it, to add on to what Andrea said, is simply, we have 3 Maritime Security Operations Center, one in Esquimalt, one in Halifax, and I think it's Sault Ste. Marie. Great Lakes, yeah. Yeah, the Great Lakes. why, given the changes that are occurring because of climate change and the opening up of the transportation routes and other things, why is there not, and why is no one talking about a maritime security operations center in the Arctic? Because you need one. Who's going to lead it? I don't know. Halifax and Esquimalt is led administratively by Defense. The one in the Great Lakes is RCMP, I believe. And I don't think Defense pays much attention to it, understandably. But who's going to lead this up? And that's going to be an important initiative. As to the ability of the department to spend it, I think everyone here knows very well of the problems of spending money in the government, the procurement problems. There are no shortage of challenges, and challenges is a nice word, barriers. I'll call them challenges, because we can overcome challenges. Barriers are a little different problem, but challenges to spending that money. One of the first big challenges, and generally when this discussion occurs, the challenge is, well, the structure of the government, the problem of procurement, we don't have a defense procurement agency, we have to deal with whatever they call themselves now, because the government, which is it? Public Works, and then we have to deal with innovation, technology, what used to be Industry Canada, and Foreign Affairs has to be involved, and this is all creates barriers and problems and slows everything down. Not that a defense agency would solve these problems, but the real big problem of spending is a simple one. National defense does not have enough bodies to be able to spend $40 billion, depending what estimates you want to listen to, over 20 years. You simply don't have the expertise because you are stretched, national defense is stretched to the limit. Day-to-day operational requirements, other requirements, unless you restructure the what's the word I'm looking for? This we get old, you forget words. The distribution of personnel and expertise resources within National Defense Headquarters to move them into these vitally operational demands to invest money to move this forward, that is going to be a major block. And there's no easy solution to that. That's an internal D&D issue. So that's what I consider to be one of the major problems that national defense faces. You then, of course, have the general government environment, and it's what I like to call, and I'm not being specifically critical of national defense, because any bureaucratic organization, any organization, including my stupid university, I shouldn't have said stupid, should I? But seeing my university has difficulties in trying to second guess, or what I call the politics of second guess of their political masters. What is going to be accepted, what isn't going to be accepted. So the drive towards the most immediate one, and again, there's problems of sequencing investments because you can't do one thing, what they call the Northern Approach's surveillance system, without doing the comms system, without doing the command and control system, without starting to do the forward operating location. It's all interlinked with one another, so where you start. But we know, for example, that the over-the-horizon backscatter radar systems are fairly mature technology. They're out there. They're American. But, of course, the department now has to manage the emphasis in government policy of indigenous, what's the words? Co-development, indigenous co-development. You have to engage the indigenous community. And that raises another series of challenges in terms of what can the indigenous community, which has to be committed and involved for sustainable development reasons, in the absence of having a well-educated and trained indigenous, Inuit, whatever you want to call them, workforce up there, which is something is really the first priority before you start to get this moving forward. Notwithstanding, of course, the industrial and technological benefits problem that's going to come out of this and how you manage it. I mean, Raytheon can manage it very well if it's Raytheon, and my guess it will be Raytheon, because you have Raytheon Canada. But again, if you start to dig deeper, these becomes major political issues from a government which understands defense investment as partially about defense of the nation, but also understands defense investment as about economic, technological innovation and development. We're not spending our defense dollars just to defend ourselves, we're spending them to enhance the Canadian economy. And those are very difficult and problematic decisions that have to be made.
So
It's not easy.
I would actually answer it very, very differently, because I think we can spend that $40 million easily, but not on new stuff. I think one of the persistent problems has been not reinvesting in basic technology, sewer lines, water lines, all of that stuff that always is overlooked. And I think it's $2 billion for all of the Canadian Armed Forces buildings, runways. Well, I can tell you there are some bases that could easily use $2 billion just so they could flush toilets properly. I think we could spend that money, but if we're going to spend it on new stuff and make it a Canadian-made jury-rigged solution, no. But if we started to look at the platforms, the basic infrastructure one needs to then have these new capabilities, that is what is always underinvested and overlooked, and that really is our Achilles heel. If we don't have functioning bases at the very basic level, then it doesn't matter how new and shiny the new capabilities are, there will be no starting point. And it's things like getting fire trucks in the Arctic, but then not planning to have a building to house the fire truck in so it's completely iced over and can't be used. It's that basic infrastructure part that I think we could easily spend that $40 billion, and it would revolutionize our economic footprint across Canada.
Think about the Treasury Board policy based on the agreement with NORAD, which is 35% of activity in the north has to be towards Inuits in terms of local community. And I would expect that any agreement with the Yukon or the Northwest Territories would have that same kind of requirement, even though the Treasury Board agreement is with Nunavut. And the sustainment contract that was done recently was actually 50% of economic benefit. So when you think, to follow on to Jim's point about the workforce skill set, regardless of what we want to spend money on in the north for NORAD renewal, with a requirement to actually have economic benefit to the Inuit and northern communities, there's challenges with that just in terms of, when you think about all of the DEW line sites now that are, in theory, that's what we're replacing, and whether we need to replace 40 sites or technology will allow us to do that with one site located in North Bay as opposed to up north. Mm-hmm. But just that kind of space that I don't know that anyone in the Department of National Defense has actually thought about in a serious way when you think about how we're going to spend that $40 billion.
Well, I think the other assumption we've made is that the military spending will drive civilian solutions. No, it's the civilian solutions that need to be there first. Because if we think we're going to send more military up to Nunavut, they can't expand. Their current sewer and water system cannot manage any more people. So you can plan to have all the F-35s eventually going up there and all of this fancy equipment, but you are always limited by the infrastructure you have there. And so rather than saying military first, what is it that we need to make a strong, secure Canada at the core, and then we can start to add on multi-purpose systems that will work for the military. But we've seen that you know, when we just think military first and look at the dew lines, well, then they didn't care that the chemicals were leaching into the environment. They just left the oil drums at the end of the runway because it was too expensive to bring back. That is wrong-headed and certainly not acceptable going forward. It has to be co-developed. What do you need on the ground to give us the platform that then we can expand and think about the defense needs?
All I would add to this is, of the 5 package areas of NORAD modernization as announced by National Defense in the fact sheet of last July, the largest amount of money over 20 years, and if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, General Huddleston, it's $15 billion to investments, to infrastructure, pardon me. And not all of it's going into the Arctic, by the way, but they haven't made that clear. To the extent to which they have considered water, sewer, housing, all these things, we have no idea. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that national defense's jurisdiction is not education and training. Someone else does that in the federal government. I don't even know which one of the... Well, yeah, but you're talking about the territory up there, and I don't know how that works up there with the money, but who's got the money? National Defense has the money. So how do you coordinate? This becomes a government structural problem, which it seems to, and I think Andrew would agree with me, that no one's talking about. Piles of money going to go in, and we're not structured to actually manage these effectively and efficiently, particularly for the local communities.
But I would also say we can't say Ottawa saying we are going to create the solution for you. They know what they need. They need open ears to say, how can we make this happen?
Is it on? Is it on? Yeah, I think what you're talking about is outside of the scope of NORAD modernization. I say that carefully because I'm not an expert, but I do know that within NORAD modernization comprises 19 projects, 14 of which are Air Force projects. We are not rebuilding the North. Everything that we build in the North will be dual purpose, but we're not $40 billion or the cash equivalent, which I think is $87 billion over 20 years, is not intended to rebuild the North. It's, and the portion, the 15 billion number, I'm not sure about that, Jim, you might be right. The number I'm more familiar with is I think in the $6 billion range, which is dedicated to Defense of Canada fighter infrastructure, which is specifically focused on the FOLs, Cold Lake, and Bagotville, the 2 DOBs, and then not only those, but the 2 MOBs, the main operating bases, but also on the DOBs, which would be Comox, Winnipeg, Trenton, and Greenwood. So given those locations and the infrastructure requirements at those locations, which you're correct upon, we've let atrophy over many years, the $6 billion is going to be expended on those limited locations. So I'm not familiar with a plan within NORAD modernization that includes this whole-scale renovation of the North, although I don't disagree that it's required in many communities and desperately required, frankly. But rebuilding the North Warning System is not part of the plan either. We'll reuse those sites, but not necessarily in the way that they've been used in the past. And if you realize that the first of the OTHRs is actually going to be located in southern Canada, and only one of them is going to be in northern Canada, I think you might be focused on you're expanding beyond what the actual NORAD modernization is focused on, not inappropriately. I mean, I very much agree with you that the North is worthy of our attention and strategic attention and of investment, but I don't think that's an aspiration within NORAD modernization. Now, that doesn't discount the challenge that you've highlighted in terms of the Air Force pushing forward 14 projects, all multi-billion-dollar projects, all transformational exercises within our Air Force. it's a true challenge. But there are a number of things that I know that we are doing to prepare for that challenge as best as we can.
I would just add, though, that things like the over-the-horizon backscatter radar in the polar one is going to require a lot of energy, and it can't be diesel-based. So it's not that necessarily D&D, the CAF, is going to come up with a solution, but the solution that they have to power that system could have implications then for other communities and open the door to thinking about, for example, modular nuclear reactors and getting away from that, the reliance on diesel. So.
Just think about the politics around the fact that we will not need 40 radar sets with the technology that exists today. What does that mean for the federal government? So back to the comment that Jim was talking about around all this stuff happens under the radar. Well, the politics of closing a bunch of these two-line sites may get the attention of the territories.
Well, they may be, so I'm speaking well beyond my knowledge of what's actually planned, but I don't believe we're actually talking about closing the sites.
Yeah, NASA took an Inuit majority-owned company, has the contract for maintenance, but also to keep them, they're still valuable. One of the things that we realized is they actually see a lot more activity than the old algorithms that analysts were using to be able to interpret. With artificial intelligence, all of a sudden you realize, oh, they're seeing more. And so the hope is that we can keep them operating, because that deterrent function of having a line that if you cross, we will see you, there's still merit to that. So it's keeping them up and functioning, but in an environmentally sustainable way as well.
They're also critical from a communications point of view and a tactical data link point of view. So I see those sites themselves having utility into the future.
Hi, Dr. Fergusson. Having been a mission commander for Optanook, I can recognize the challenges in communication with our Navy, but the value of the Navy in the North. You spoke a lot about how we need to shift our role and responsibility to our maritime. Is there modernization, sir, or both of you, within NORAD's role in working with the Navy and maybe sharing that more outside of the CJOC, or maybe going into more of a modernization in a parallel in that realm?
As part of NORAD modernization, the Navy's not in. Simple as that. As far as the 14 projects you're talking about, there's nothing about the Navy. The Navy needs to be engaged because there are potentially maritime sensors which will add to all domain awareness. I don't know a great deal about the Arctic offshore patrol vessels capabilities. We're not maritime people. In fact, interesting enough, Andrew and I talk about maybe we need to go take a closer look back to the maritime world for maritime warning. So I can't really answer your question, and I don't know what the Navy's thinking, but they certainly should be thinking about the Arctic, and more simply because then simply the AOPS vessels, which are a valuable contribution, but there may in fact need to be a much greater contribution from the Navy and integration, not just with the Navy, but with Coast Guard and transport and other forces up there. So I wish I could answer your question. Maybe if where's the mines people? Maybe you can give me some money, I'll go and investigate. We'll go investigate this. But it is a real big issue, and it speaks to the fact that despite the talk, and again, I'll be bad person again, I'd be critical, despite the talk of jointness, the service stovepipes have not gone away. And they need to be overcome. There's been great advances, I will accept that, but they really need to be overcome. And to end this this is my personal, it's intuitive, it's not systematic, based on systematic evidence. The Navy is the Navy. The Navy doesn't want to be in the Arctic. They have a mentality which makes them want to go sail the blue 7 seas with the U.S. Navy and do big things. They don't want to be there. At least if you go back to the Harper years and the forced imposition of the Arctic offshore patrol vessels on the Navy. The government forced it. One of the few times the government actually forced defense to do something. But it is a big issue. And as I said about the Maritime Security Operations Center, we need to start talking about one of those up there. And it includes also a space-based center up there. We've talked for years, the Defense Department, or I should say the Space Field Defense Department, have talked for years about need to have ground stations moved further north into the Arctic. Well, we need those now. And that's something that's not, I don't see on the priority list. It may be hidden somewhere, but you may be able to talk about this.
It's not that hidden. There are joint capabilities in NORAD modernization, but they're not tagged as joint capabilities per se, because they completely underpin the NORAD mission. So there are capabilities that will benefit the maritime warning system in the north, including surveillance systems like RPAS. RPAS will have a role to play in our north, but communication systems and some satellite projects as well. I can't remember whether it extends to ground control stations, but I believe it does, though. I'd have to go back into the specifics of the 19 projects, but you'll see there, Jim, that there are projects that will have huge joint benefit once they come into being. Despite the huge challenges associated. The real focus of so it was divided into NORAD modernization, but there has been a realization that that's not enough. And the current defense policy update, which I believe the name may have changed recently, but they've been studying the next step, which would include the joint aspect, any of the missing parts that were considered missing by the Army and the Navy, which would be on the joint side, not so linked to NORAD, but linked to our overall requirements for continental defense.
I understand. I mean, when I refer to space ground stations, this goes back to the development of RadarSat, and I think there's 1 or 2 stations in the southern Canada which can receive directly RadarSat data and information. And there's been talk for, Jesus, I'm getting really old, 20 plus years of the need to develop another ground station, particularly in the Arctic, because of the polar flight paths of RadarSat and then futures. So I know it's there, and I know it's all joint. What I don't know is, and we have, of course, the commitment that's part of NORAD modernization, which is sort of yes and sort of no, and this is the problem of what is and is not NORAD modernization, of the development of a space-based capability, a new military-dedicated space-based constellation to do, and here's the problem, there's a question mark, because it doesn't tell us. Now, I'm going to sniff around and find out what's really going on, and hopefully, and we're all awaiting, at least Andrea and I are awaiting, for the defense review to come out, the update to come out and find out what's in there. And that's one of the difficulties of being an outside observer and academic, and I understand why things are not always as transparent and accountable as we as academics would like them to be. I fully understand why that is the case. But eventually we need to know. We need to find out, and we're hoping for fidelity and clarity when the update, which will, I'm sure, start to deal with more joint issues. Because as I said, jointness has come a long way over my academic career watching this. It's come a hell of a long way. Is it where it needs to be? Not yet. But it's getting there, slow. Governments work slowly. Problem is, I'll probably be dead by the time they get it all right. But that's a different problem for me.
This question's for all of you guys. My name's Brett Stark. So about an hour and a half ago, I put a post on my Instagram asking people if they knew what NORAD is. And I have a fairly large following on Instagram, and it's 15% yes, 85% no. So I haven't read this book, but assuming it's about ensuring our defensive priorities and funding and public knowledge, it seems to me like popular politics and public opinion is shifting away from military and NORAD and the importance of such. So my question would be to all of you is, what's the strategy, and is there a strategy to teach and get the message across to those people in our population who are outside of the academic communities, outside of the military communities, especially with 400 to 500,000 new Canadians coming into the country every year? Sorry for the loaded question.
That's a great question and a fantastic poll. And you know what? It's not just NORAD, NATO too. There was a poll done of, in middle school and high school of how many knew what NATO was, and they didn't know what it was. And I think that speaks to, decisions about school curricula. Certainly Jim and I try and teach it at the university level, but that presupposes they have understanding of basic history, which includes Canada's military history, and we realize it's hit and miss. It often is very school dependent, very teacher dependent. There are, some amazing teachers across Canada that make military history a part of the curriculum, but it generally isn't. And thank goodness for programs like the D&D Minds program that recognizes that academic study of things like NORAD and NATO has benefit to the national interest. But you're right, it's an uphill battle. And, the one thing that NORAD has is the Santa Tracker program. And it is identifiable, and it is the best way to introduce people to the start of what it is that NORAD does. It gets kids excited about it. Now, I've argued for a long time now that Santa has a supply ship, and that really should be tracked by NORAD as well. So I'm hoping to see that in the future, but it is those things that make NORAD relevant for Canadians and Americans, because otherwise they are out of sight and out of mind, and that is the whole problem with deterrence. I mean, you don't know about deterrence until something goes very, very wrong, and that's what we're all trying to avoid. So how do you teach a subject that should, in theory, never happen? And that's really, really difficult.
Sure. Yeah, maybe you're the pessimist. So it's a big problem. We just did. We've got the RCF's 100th anniversary coming up next year, and so we did a survey of similar to the one that you conducted, but we used our roundel. So how many Canadians recognized what the Canadian Air Force, the Royal Canadian Air Force roundel, actually represented? And it was about 13%. 20% thought it was Canadian Tire. 50% thought it was a new Jets jersey. About 13% realized that it was the RCAF. So at least in our organization, I'm sure the Navy and the Army are looking to do the same thing and faced by the recruiting challenge. So we've got an attrition problem, we've got a recruiting problem, we also have a retention problem, but the recruiting problem is the one that links to your question about education and attraction, and we're very much focused on that. So the RCAF isn't in charge of recruiting, but we are very much able to work on attracting. So we're setting out currently to do much more of that. We've been engaging at community colleges, sending aircraft to interact with the students at the community colleges, whether pilots, technicians, or otherwise. We're trying to expand our the fly pass that we do with the snowbirds. Remember, during COVID, we did op-ed separation. We're trying to do more of that. For example, the snowbirds will be overflying a rock festival or a country/rock festival in PEI this summer. Instead of being in Ottawa for Canada Day, they'll be over the Halifax Harbor. We're trying to use what we have in a more focused way to connect with a wider swathe of the Canadian population for exactly the reason that you've pointed out. Now, it's going to be a slow process, obviously, and we're going to have to dedicate ourselves to it. But the recruiting problem that we have is really a serious
not existential, but it's a serious problem. We have to get our heads around that. So the problem that you've highlighted is very much the focus of the CAF and very much the focus of the RCAF. You'll see us doing more. You'll see us doing more outreach. You'll see us focusing more on the home game so that we can find these people and encourage them to become part of the RCAF. We want to make the RCAF more attractive. We face some headwinds, COVID being one of them, but also the cultural situations, the cultural issues that we've seen, and the stories that have been exposed. These are difficult, and we need to do better in that space. We need to demonstrate to Canadians that we are still an organization that can earn their respect, and that is available to them to serve within, to serve their country within. I think we're moving in the right direction, but that statistic's not surprising. We will be working on trying to do better in that space.
Be good.
Be good. I don't disagree with General Hunston. I don't really disagree with Andrea, but in fact, I disagree with both of them. I think the point of recruitment and the need to pay attention and put better resources and a more directed and focused recruitment program is vitally important. It's something that's been neglected. I'm not an expert on this. Your wife is, because she wrote an MA on this one. Is something that's been neglected way too long. But what the focus will be on recruitment, the message you're going to give out on recruitment to entice young people. I think back to the old days, I remember U.S. Army, where they would have a soldier march in with uniform and a rifle into an armed personnel carrier, and then the ramp would load down, and he'd step out in a suit with a briefcase. You know, what the message you want to say to recruit people is not a message that's going to inform them and educate them whatsoever about NORAD, about NATO, or broader principles of Canadian defense policy. Because that's not the way you're going to attract them. At least that's my view. So here where I am a real Canadian heretic. Someday the government's going to take my citizenship away. And I'll tell you the answer I've given for years now. Let's leave the public out of this. It's pointless. I've heard this for 30 years. Program after program after program, and it fails every time. Why does it fail? It fails because most of the Canadian public, different from the American public, which have a different value attached to defense and security, most of the Canadian public are not interested. They deal with day-to-day problems. The economy, housing, inflation, food, healthcare, that's what their attention is. And if you put this in the context of a representative democracy, what the public is really telling the political world, their representatives, this is your responsibility to make sure we are devolving this responsibility to you. If you think in terms of political salience for health, the economy, inflation, all the housing, all those things, homeless, all that thing, it's much more a sense of a direct democracy idea where the public is pushing things forward. Domestic debates because it's salient. But when you get the defense and security world, by security I'm excluding crime and all that stuff. But in the defense world, the public's attitude, this is your responsibility. This is responsible democracy. The government needs to deal with this. We expect you to deal with it properly. And stop, and this is my view, and this is where heresy really steps in. Stop using the public as a political football in this game. The public demands this, the public demands this, that. They're not demanding anything. I mean, there's small voices like Andrea and I that are pushing, pointing fingers. And there's other voices which are on the left that are pointing fingers. But they have no political relevance to this world. And that's a message I think government needs to start doing. It's their responsibility to defend Canada. Don't wait for the public to go with this. And besides, as I've learned, and I'm sure Andrea has, and I'm sure all of you have, defense is extremely complicated business. It's not something the public can really understand. You'll understand more about NORAD, read the book. But want you to really understand, because there's acronyms, there's all sorts of things that make it very difficult unless you, why it took us 10 years to write this down, to get ourselves enmeshed in this. So why is anyone expect the public? Santa Track is good. I don't know if Andrea disagrees, but Santa Track is good. At least it's something that's nice. So that's a bit of heresy.
I wasn't going to say anything, and you're probably grateful for that, but just following on from Mr. Stark's comment about low name recognition of NORAD, isn't that the way we want it? We started this session off that way, and I think it's a perfectly good way to for it to light. But as to the question of general awareness of Canadian defense issues, I'm going to be even more pessimistic than you. Canada does not notice defense until we have lost a battalion. That was true in World War I, it was true in World War II, and we got pretty heavily pounded in Korea. So, no, that's what it takes to get Canadians focused. After that, we can have internal squabbles, but eventually we raise enough troops to make a meaningful contribution to a global war. And so I'm not sure what I'd like to prescribe, but I think Mr. Putin and Mr. Zelensky will eventually provide us with an excuse or a reason.
I'm not gonna discount that, but I'd say that we're in a different dynamic and a different dilemma today, because we're in a come-as-you-are world. And so we can't afford to use the mentality of having time to prepare for the battles of the future. We have to prepare for them now.
I'm not sure we have a choice.
Pardon me?
I'm not sure that we have a choice.
We don't have a choice not to prepare. Or, well, we do have a choice, but then we won't be capable.
But I think we need to realize, from a government perspective, when we have soldiers in harm's way and they're coming home in a procession from Trenton to downtown Toronto, the government paid attention and it made decisions quickly, and the Canadian population paid attention. So part of that is an issue of when we have people in harm's way, you get the attention that you need. And when you don't have people in harm's way, there are far more things that are important to Canadian citizens than the military. But, I mean, we need to give credit where credit is due in terms of when we actually put people in harm's way, decisions get made, economic benefits don't become an issue. It's what does the military need? And the Canadian public pays attention. Mm-hmm. Recruiting was up during the early years of Afghanistan.
I think what we're trying to do in this book is say is we are in harm's way. It's all of us here in North America, and that's been a tough sell. I'd like to say, thank you to the Chinese high-altitude balloon, because that was helpful to orient people towards the importance of being able to track things and the important role that NORAD played. But that's been a really it's been a meme in Canada. We are safe, we are loved, nobody wants to attack us, everything's fine. And I would encourage everybody to read Brigadier General Peter Fessler and General retired Mike O'Shaughnessy's paper, Hardening the Shield, where they're all but grabbing us by the lapels to say we are vulnerable and we are going to be held hostage here, which means we can't do the away fight because the bulk of our assets to go over there is here. And it doesn't take much to hold us to ransom and take out some critical infrastructure. So that's more than a defense issue. But I think at the end of the day, that's why we're so passionate about NORAD. You don't realize how important it is until it is not funded, or it fails, or it's taken away. And I think we've come close to times when it's maybe been almost marginalized out of existence. And that's why we need people to care. So keep asking those questions. And Twitter is a marvelous tool sometimes for piquing interest and getting people talking. So
I would just add one quick last thing about this. Let's remember, despite my remarks and your remarks, which I agree with entirely, and your remarks I agree with entirely, from every indication, and the only evidence I have of this is over the past 10, 20 years, the uptake at public ceremonies, Remembrance Day. That it's amazing. I remember when I was in the 70s, the evil 70s, the hippie 70s, they were very poorly intended by the public. Now you recognize is that the public backs the Canadian forces, and it's a good thing for recruitment. But backing the Canadian forces, supporting the Canadian forces, is not the same as a defense policy question. That's a different thing altogether. The second thing, the government lucked out in Afghanistan, as they did in Yugoslavia. It was fine. What scared the government to death was not 1 or 2 soldiers coming back, but a full unit getting wiped out in a combat. That would have blown their circuits. Because you know what? Where the fingers would then been pointed right at the government. So they sort of lucked themselves out. But if it comes to a major confrontation, it comes to war, despite many people wonder about the Canadian public, I have no worries. The Canadian public will stand up as it always has. Not that it will know why it's really standing up, but that's a different problem.
Are there any other questions at this moment? If we're not seeing any, then I'm going to close off the question and answer period of this evening. Thank you very much, Major General Huddleston, Dr. Charron, Dr. Fergusson, for being with us today for your book launch of NORAD in Perpetuity and Beyond. Thank you so much for everybody who's gathered here this evening. We offer the book for sale at the back, and if you're lucky, our authors might sign your copy. So thank you so much for this evening.
Thank you.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now and thank you for joining us.